Clara. May Sutton pressed her flour-dusted hand flat against the stagecoach door, took one breath so deep her whole body shook with it, and stepped down into the dust of Hardin Creek, Wyoming. Knowing full well the moment her boots hit that ground, there was no road left behind her worth taking. The bruise along her jaw had faded to yellow. The one around her heart had not. She was 34 years old. She was alone, and she was carrying a sourdough starter in a wooden box, like it was the last living thing in the world that still trusted her. Because it was. If this story moves something in you, I hope you'll subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The driver did not help her with the trunk. He dropped it in the dirt, the way a man drops something he has already decided has no value. Dusted his hands against his thighs, and looked at her with that particular expression she had learned to recognize over 6 days of travel. The slow downward scan, the slight tightening around the mouth, the decision made before a single word was spoken. "End of the line, miss," he said. "Hardin Creek. You sure this is where you want to be?" "I'm sure," Clara May said. She was not sure. She had never been less sure of anything in her life. But she had learned a long time ago that certainty was a luxury, and she could not afford luxuries anymore. What she could afford was this one trunk, one wooden box held against her chest with both arms, and a telegram from a rancher named Hank Dyer, who needed a cook and had not asked a single question about what she looked like. That last part had mattered more than she wanted to admit. The coach rolled away. Clara May stood in the road and looked at what was in front of her. Hardin Creek was not a kind-looking town. The buildings leaned into each other like tired men. The main road was a river of mud from last week's rain, and the few people moving along the boardwalk had already paused to look at her with the open, unapologetic curiosity of people who did not see enough new faces to bother pretending otherwise. She felt their eyes move over her, the way she had felt it her whole life. That long measuring look that started at the top and traveled down slowly, the way you'd measure a piece of furniture to see whether it would fit through a door. She was not a small woman. She had never been a small woman. Edmund had spent 3 years reminding her of that, like it was something she might have forgotten. She picked up her trunk with both hands, shifted the wooden box under one arm, and started walking toward the edge of town, where the telegram had told her Hardin Ranch sat at the base of the first hill. She had not walked 20 yards before she heard it. "Lord Almighty!" A woman's voice, not even lowered. "They sent for that." Laughter. 2 voices, then 3. Clara May did not stop walking. She had learned that stopping gave them the satisfaction of watching you process it. You kept moving. You kept your chin level. You breathed through your nose. And somewhere deep in the part of you that had not been beaten all the way down, yet you held on to the one thing they could not reach, the knowledge that their opinion of your body had never once had anything to do with your worth, even if you had spent years letting someone convince you otherwise. She kept walking. The ranch appeared around a bend in the road, and it looked exactly the way desperate places always looked, like it had once had ambition and lost track of it somewhere along the way. The main house was solid enough, 2 stories, good bones, but the paint had been peeling so long it seemed to have given up the idea of paint entirely. Fences sagged. The barn door hung at a tired angle. Grass grew where grass should not have been growing, and the whole property had the particular quiet of a place where one person had been doing the work of 4 for a very long time. A man came out of the barn when he heard her footsteps on the gravel. Hank Dyer was somewhere past 40, built like a man who had spent those 40 years arguing with the land and losing points, but never the argument. Broad through the shoulders, weathered in the face, with hands so calloused and work roughened that when he crossed his arms, looking at her, she could see the texture of them from 10 feet away. He wore his grief the way some men wore old coats, like it had been there so long he had stopped noticing the weight of it. He looked at her the same way everyone else had, but he did not say anything about what he saw. "You're the cook," he said. "Baker," Clara May said. "Clara May Sutton. I bake, I cook. I keep a clean kitchen, and I don't cause trouble. Your telegram said $50 a month and room and board." "It did." "Then we have an agreement." He stared at her for a long moment. She held the stare. She had learned that too, that the moment you looked away first, they decided something about you that was very hard to undo. "Follow me," Hank said. The kitchen was a catastrophe. She had expected neglect. She had not expected this particular quality of neglect, the kind that builds up not from laziness, but from grief, from the slow withdrawal of a person who had simply stopped being able to care about things like clean surfaces and organized shelves. The stove was caked with months of burnt residue. The basin smelled like standing water and regret. Flour and sugar sat in open barrels that had been visited extensively by mice. Dishes were stacked in configurations that suggested no one had washed them in a deliberate, top-to-bottom way in quite some time. "Last cook left 4 months ago," Hank said from the doorway. "Before her another woman. Before that—" He stopped. "It doesn't matter. You'll do the job or you'll go. I don't have patience for complications." Clara May set the wooden box down on the cleanest section of counter she could find, which was not very clean. She opened the lid, carefully checked the sourdough starter inside, still alive, still bubbling faintly despite 6 days of travel, and closed it again. "I'll need supplies," she said. "Proper flour, fresh salt and sugar in sealed containers, new dish towels. That stove needs to be stripped down and re-seasoned before I use it for anything meant for human consumption. I'll need to know how many I'm cooking for any dietary concerns and what time meals are expected." Hank blinked. She got the sense he had been expecting either complaints or collapse, not a list delivered in a flat businesslike tone. "3, he said. "Me, my foreman Boyd, and my daughter." A pause. "She doesn't eat much." "How old?" 8. Something moved across his face, not quite pain, but adjacent to it. "You don't interact with her. You don't try to befriend her. You don't speak to her unless she speaks to you first, and she won't, so that takes care of it. You leave her entirely alone." Clara May looked at him. "What's her name?" "That's not your concern. I'd like to know the name of the child I'm cooking for." The silence stretched. A muscle worked in his jaw. "Lily," he said. "And she doesn't speak. She hasn't said a word in 2 years." His voice went flat and hard, the way voices go when they are covering something that still has sharp edges. "Doctors don't know why. I'm done expecting them to figure it out. Just leave her be." He left before she could respond. Clara May stood in the wrecked kitchen for a moment. Then she rolled up her sleeves, tucked her skirt hem into her waistband to keep it out of the muck, and got to work. It took her 7 hours to make the kitchen functional. She was not a small woman, and she had never pretended otherwise, but she was strong in the particular way of women who have spent their lives using their bodies as tools rather than ornaments. Her arms were solid. Her back was accustomed to sustained effort. She hauled water she scrubbed with a ferocity that came from somewhere deeper than cleanliness. She stripped the stove surface down to bare iron and re-seasoned it with a small tin of lard she found buried behind a broken crock. She dumped the contaminated flour. She found the mice damage and dealt with it without drama. She worked until the kitchen smelled like wood smoke and possibility instead of rot and abandonment. When Boyd came in at noon looking for lunch, he stopped in the doorway and stared. "Lord," he said slowly, "you actually cleaned it." "I actually cleaned it," Clara May confirmed. She handed him a plate of beans she had salvaged from half-good ingredients, onions from the root cellar salt pork, from a tin dried beans she had boiled soft. Not her best work, but honest food. Boyd sat down. He was younger than Hank, maybe 30, with a face that smiled easily and eyes that noticed things. Mexican and Irish, he'd tell her later, with the confident air of a man who considered his origins a point of interest rather than anything to apologize for. "I'm Boyd Sullivan," he said. "I'm not exactly the foreman. I'm more like," he considered, "the cousin who stayed. Clara May Sutton." "You come a long way, Miss Clara May." "Far enough." He looked at her over his beans, and she could see him trying to calculate how much to ask. People always had that calculation on their faces when they spoke to her. She had learned to wait them out. "Hank tell you about Lily?" Boyd asked. "He told me she doesn't speak. 2 years." Boyd set his fork down. "Right around when Sarah died. That's his wife." Fever took her fast 2 winters back before I could even get a doctor up from town. Emma went quiet same week. He corrected himself. Lily, sorry. Hank used to call her Emma sometimes when Sarah was alive. Old habit, after he stopped. Clara May filed that away. He hasn't been right since, Boyd continued. Not cruel, but gone somewhere. Works from before sunup to after dark, doesn't speak unless he has to, doesn't let anyone close to Lily because he's afraid she'll get attached, and then whoever it is will leave like everyone else has. The other cooks. One couldn't take the isolation. One left with a traveling salesman. Hank doesn't talk about the one before that. Boyd picked his fork back up. I'm not telling you this to scare you off. I'm telling you because you seem like someone who likes knowing the territory before she walks into it. I do, Clara May said. She went back to her work. That night, she fed the starter. She had brought it from Boston in the wooden box, fed it at every stop, kept the cloth around the jar damp during the train rides when the air went dry. It had been her grandmother's, passed down through 3 generations of women who had understood that some things worth keeping require daily tending. It had survived the journey. It was still alive. She was checking the jar when she felt eyes on her. Slowly she turned. A girl stood in the kitchen doorway. 8 years old, dark-haired, wearing a dress that had been let out at the hem and still wasn't quite long enough. Her boots were too large. But it was her face that stopped Clara May. Not the face itself, which was a plain, pretty serious face, but the expression on it. The absolute stillness. Not shyness. Not caution. Something older and more deliberate than either of those things. The stillness of a creature that has learned to go very quiet so that the world forgets it is there. Hello? Clara May said. She kept her voice the same way she kept the starter, gentle, steady, warm, but not demanding. I'm Clara May. I'm the new cook. The girl stared. I'm feeding my starter, Clara May said, turning back to the jar. See the bubbles? That means it's alive. I know that sounds strange, but it's true. There are thousands of tiny creatures living in here, and every day I feed them a little flour and water, and they keep working for me. She paused. It came from my grandmother. It's probably older than this ranch. Not a sound from the doorway. I made beans for supper, Clara May said. There's cornbread, too. I left a plate on the table if you're hungry. She did not look at the girl. She had learned this from years of watching frightened things. Cat's children herself in mirrors, that a direct gaze too soon felt like a demand. Go to your room. Hank's voice came from the hallway, quiet but firm. Clara May heard small feet retreat without a sound. Hank appeared in the doorway. His eyes went from the girl's absence to Clara May's back. I told you not to speak to her. She came to the kitchen, Clara May said, still not turning. I spoke. I didn't touch her, didn't approach her, didn't ask anything of her. I talked about sourdough. I don't care what you talked about. I know. Now she turned slowly. Mr. Dyer, I understand why you're protecting her. I do. But I'm going to be in this kitchen every day, and she's going to come through that door, and the kindest thing I can do for both of us is be exactly what I am. Steady, quiet, and unthreatening, and let her decide what to do with that. Something shifted in his expression. Not softness exactly, but a small crack in the hardness. Who gave you those bruises? He asked. Her hand moved towards her wrist before she could stop it. The finger-shaped marks had faded to yellow-green, but apparently not enough. Someone who won't be a problem anymore, she said. You running from the law? No. From a man. She met his eyes steadily. From a monster. There's a difference. The silence between them was not comfortable, but it was honest. He looked at her the way people looked when they were deciding whether to trust something they couldn't fully see yet. Dinner's at 6, he said finally. Breakfast at 5. Boyd takes a packed lunch to the fields at noon. You burn the bread, you're gone. You cause trouble, you're gone. He paused. You go near my daughter in a way I don't like. I won't, Clara May said. He left. She stood alone in the clean kitchen, listening to the beans simmer and the starter breathe, and for the first time in longer than she could calculate, she felt something that was not quite hope, but was the place where hope begins, a small, stubborn warmth in her chest, like a fire that has been banked low through a long winter and is just now being given a little air. She woke at 4 the next morning, unable to sleep past the habit of early rising that Edmund had beaten into her during the first year of their marriage, and that she had never been able to shake even after everything else had changed. The room was small, a narrow bed, a washstand, a window facing east, but it was hers, and no one could come through the door without her knowledge, and that alone was worth more than she had words for. She went to the kitchen and started the stove. Bread required honesty. That was what her grandmother had always said, and Clara May had come to believe it more thoroughly than almost anything else. You could not rush it, could not trick it, could not dress it up to be something it was not. You brought flour, water, salt, and time. You kneaded until your shoulders burned. You waited without forcing. And if you brought the right quality of attention to every step, not perfectionism, not anxiety, but genuine patient care, you got something real. Something that fed people in a way that went past the physical. She made 4 loaves. Then she found eggs in the coop behind the house. The hens were not pleased to see her, but she had grown up on a farm and knew how to negotiate with chickens, and she fried bacon and potatoes and started coffee thick and dark. When Hank walked in at 5:45, his plate was already on the table. He stopped. "Something wrong?" Clara May asked. "No." He sat down slowly. "It's just, nobody's cooked breakfast in this house in a long time." He ate in silence. When he was done, he carried his plate to the basin. She noticed that. He didn't leave it for her to deal with, just quietly moved it, and on his way out he paused. "Bread's good," he said. And he was gone. That was when Clara May understood that Hank Dyer was not a cruel man. He was a man who had built walls so high and so fast after loss hit him that he had accidentally sealed himself inside them. He did not know how to come down. He was simply waiting without knowing he was waiting for something strong enough to make the climb worth trying. Boyd declared the kitchen a miracle when he came for lunch. He ate 2 pieces of bread before his beans and talked the entire time with the enthusiasm of a man who had been eating hardtack for 4 months. Clara May liked him immediately and completely, the way you like people who make no secret of what they think and mean no harm by any of it. "You're going to be a problem," Boyd told her cheerfully, helping himself to a 3rd piece of bread. "How's that? You're too good at this. Now we'll expect it every day." He grinned. "Welcome to Hardin Ranch, Miss Clara May. Don't let anyone run you off." That evening she left Lily's plate on the kitchen table. Pot roast carrots, a thick slice of bread with honey, a small cup of warm milk. She went back to the dishes, without looking toward the hallway. She heard the small feet come, heard the chair scrape very slightly, heard the particular silence of a child sitting down carefully, not wanting to make noise. She kept washing dishes. When she turned an hour later to check the stove, the plate was empty. The chair was pushed back in, and Clara May stood there in the lamplight, this large and complicated woman who had survived too much to be easily moved and felt something crack open quietly behind her sternum. Not grief, not even joy exactly. Just the recognition that sometimes healing announced itself in the smallest possible gestures, in a child who ate what was left for her in the dark, and that those gestures deserved to be honored by not making too much of them. She said nothing to Hank about it. She said nothing to Boyd. She simply left the plate the next night and the night after that, and let Lily take what she was ready to take in her own time and on her own terms. Because that was what safety looked like when it was real. It didn't demand anything in return. At the end of her first week, Clara May made cinnamon rolls. She'd found cinnamon in the back of a cupboard, dusty, but still fragrant. She had good butter now. Boyd had arranged it from his cousin's dairy, and she had enough sugar and enough flour and enough time before dawn to do it right. She rolled the dough thin, spread butter and cinnamon sugar in a careful, even layer, rolled it tight, cut it into spirals, let them rise until they were soft and pillow round, and slid them into the oven. The smell when they began to bake was the smell of her grandmother's kitchen. It was the smell of every good thing she had ever known before Edmund, before Boston, before 3 years of learning to make herself small enough to be safe. It was so overwhelmingly itself that she had to press both flour-dusted hands flat on the counter and breathe. She was pulling them from the oven when she felt eyes on her, Lily stood in the doorway, not the cautious hovering of previous mornings, but planted fully there, her gaze fixed on the pan with an expression that was the most alive thing Clara May had seen on that child's face yet. Hunger. Not the ordinary kind. The kind that reaches for something it cannot name. Clara May frosted one roll while it was still hot, set it on a small plate, and placed it on the table. She did not look at the girl. She did not say, "Come here," or "Aren't you hungry?" or any of the well-meaning things that would have made this about her instead of about Lily. "They're better warm," she said to the counter. "But they keep until morning if you'd rather wait." She went back to frosting the others. She heard small footsteps, heard the chair, heard the silence of a child tasting something that tasted like more than food. Then, so quiet, it was almost not a sound at all, barely more than a breath shaped into syllables, "Thank you." Clara May's hand stopped moving. She did not turn around. She did not gasp or react or make the moment into something the child would feel responsible for. She stood perfectly still, her frosting knife suspended, and she breathed slowly, and she kept her voice when she found it absolutely level. "You're welcome," she said. To the pan, to the counter, to the ordinary morning air. She heard the chair scrape, heard small feet, turned a minute later to find the plate empty and the kitchen exactly as it had been. And Clara May Sutton, who had survived a husband who told her she was worthless, a town that had laughed at her the moment she stepped off a coach and 6 days of travel that would have broken someone with less in her chest to hold on to, put both hands over her face and let herself cry. Not from sadness, from the relief of knowing that some things, even after everything, still grew. She didn't tell Hank. She didn't tell Boyd. She tucked that moment away like a seed in good soil and went back to work. Because that was what you did with precious things. You protected them until they were strong enough to stand on their own. Lily began appearing in the kitchen more often after that. Always when Hank was out. She had some instinct for his schedule, had probably been mapping the rhythms of the house for 2 silent years, and she knew when it was safe to simply exist somewhere other than her room. She would sit at the kitchen table and watch Clara May work, and Clara May would talk. Not at the girl, not with demands for response built into the words. Just talk, a steady, warm narration of what her hands were doing and why the way her grandmother had talked to her when she was small and the world was still mostly good. "The starter's alive," she explained one morning, holding up the bubbling jar so Lily could see. "Every one of these bubbles is a tiny creature eating and breathing. My grandmother got this from her mother, who got it from her mother before that. It's probably over 100 years old." She watched Lily's eyes go wide. "When I bake bread with it, I'm putting all those creatures to work. They eat the sugar in the flour, and they release gas, and that gas is what makes bread rise. They've been doing that work longer than this state has existed." Lily wrinkled her nose. "I know," Clara May said. "It sounds strange, but most of the best things are strange if you look at them closely enough." And when Lily reached out one morning and touched the side of the jar, curious and careful, and then looked up to see if that was allowed, Clara May just nodded once and kept talking, because yes, it was allowed. In this kitchen, everything was allowed except pretending to be less than you were. 3 weeks in on a morning that smelled like rain coming, and the bread was rising. Well. Lily climbed up onto the stool beside the counter and looked at Clara May with those serious 200-year-old eyes. "Can I help?" she said. Clara May handed her a wooden spoon without pausing. "Stir that while I measure the salt," she said. "Not too fast. Bread doesn't like to be rushed." They worked side by side in the quiet kitchen, and Clara May felt the particular rightness of it. This child who had gone silent, finding her voice again, not because anyone demanded it of her, but because someone had simply made a space where it was safe to speak. When Hank came in for dinner that evening and found his daughter standing on a stool at the counter, carefully folding cornbread batter under Clara May's direction, he stopped in the doorway. Clara May looked up. "She's helping," she said simply. "We're making cornbread." The silence lasted long enough that she heard Lily's stirring falter. Slightly, heard the child feel the tension in the air and brace against it. The way all children who have learned that adults' moods can change, a room will brace. "Keep stirring," Clara May said to Lily quietly and steadily. Even strokes, that's right. After a moment, she heard Hank's boots on the floor, heard him pull out his chair, heard him sit down. He didn't say a word about it. But that night when Lily carried her plate to the dinner table and sat down across from her father, instead of taking it to her room, Hank Dyer reached for the cornbread with a hand that was not entirely steady. Clara May pretended not to notice, but she noticed. The next morning, Clara May found a wildflower on the kitchen counter. It was small purple, the kind that grew in the grass along the fence line, and it had been placed very deliberately beside the starter jar, its stem tucked into a crack in the wood so it would stand upright. She stood looking at it for a long moment, with her hands at her sides and her throat doing something complicated, and then she went about starting the stove because the bread still needed tending and some things were best honored quietly. She did not mention the flower to anyone. Lily came to the kitchen that morning at her usual time, sliding in through the side door, with the particular silence she'd carried so long it seemed less like a habit now and more like a second skin. She was slowly, carefully learning to step out of. She climbed onto her stool. She looked at the flower. She looked at Clara May. "Thank you," Clara May said, to the dough, to the counter, to the same ordinary morning air she'd been speaking into for weeks now. Lily's mouth curved at one corner. Not quite a smile, something working toward one. They made bread together that morning without speaking much, and what they did say was small and practical and exactly right. "Hand me that bowl. Press here, not there. Feel that. That's when you know it's ready." Clara May had discovered that Lily learned best through her hands, through the physical language of doing, and so she had begun teaching that way, placing the girl's small palms against the dough, letting her feel the difference between under-kneaded and ready, between a loaf that needed more time and one that was genuinely done. It was, Clara May thought, not so different from teaching herself. There were things you could only know by feeling them. Boyd came in for breakfast in the middle of this and stood in the doorway, watching with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Something between relief and something older and more careful than relief. "Morning, Lilybug," he said. Lily looked at him. She raised one flour-dusted hand in a small wave. Boyd sat down very slowly, like a man trying not to startle something. He ate his eggs without talking for once, which told Clara May more about how significant that small wave was than any amount of words could have. When Hank came in at 6, Clara May had his plate ready and the kitchen warm and the bread cooling on the rack. He looked at Lily on her stool. He looked at Clara May at the stove. He sat down and ate, and did not say a word about any of it. But before he left, he paused at the door with his back to both of them. "Bread's good," he said. Same as he always said. But this time, Clara May heard something underneath the words that hadn't been there before. Not gratitude exactly. More like a man who has been holding his breath for 2 years and is beginning slowly, and against his better judgment, to let it out. The trouble came on a Thursday. Clara May had ridden into town with Boyd for the weekly supply run, leaving Lily with strict instructions to check the bread at 9 o'clock and not touch the starter without her. Hardin Creek's general store was run by a woman named Patsy Howell, broad-shouldered and businesslike, who had taken to Clara May's bread with the practical enthusiasm of someone who recognized quality and knew what to do with it. She'd already started asking for extra loaves, selling them from the counter to miners and railroad workers, who came through looking for something that tasted like it had been made by a person who cared about the outcome. Clara May was waiting on her supply order when she heard the voice. "Well, I'll be." She felt it before she understood it, that particular cold that starts in the stomach and moves outward the body, knowing danger a half-second before the mind catches up. She turned slowly. The man leaning against the far wall was named Chet Pruitt. He'd been one of Edmund's drinking companions back in Boston, the kind of man who appeared at other people's dinner tables and smiled too easily and always seemed to know exactly how much leverage he had on everyone in the room. He was holding a glass of something amber and looking at her with the bright, calculating eyes of a man who has just found something valuable in an unexpected place. "Mary Cunningham," he said pleasantly. "Off a long way from home." "Wrong person," Clara May said. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of that. My name is Clara May Sutton. Sure it is. He pushed off from the wall and moved toward her, and she did not step back because she had promised herself 6 days ago on that stagecoach that she was done stepping back. Edmund's been looking everywhere for you, you know. Real concerned. Says you took something valuable when you left. I took nothing. That's not what he's telling people. Chet's voice dropped, but didn't lose its pleasantness, which was the more dangerous register. There's a reward out. $500 for information about your whereabouts. Now that's a lot of money for a man in my position. The store had gone quiet around them, the way stores go quiet when something real is happening. Clara May felt the watching without turning to look at it. I'll give you 1,000, she said quietly. Chet blinked, then he laughed. You don't have $1,000? Not yet. Give me 60 days. Why would I wait 60 days for a maybe when I've got $500 certain right now? Because if Edmund comes here, Clara May said, keeping her voice low and even, he's going to want to know who found me first and didn't tell him immediately. You know what Edmund does with people who make themselves inconvenient, Chet. You've seen it. You want him asking questions about why you waited. The calculation behind his eyes shifted. She watched him run the numbers, not money numbers, but the more important kind. The odds of Edmund's anger turned toward him. 60 days, she repeated. $1,000. You never saw me. He studied her for a long moment. 45 days, he said. And if you run, I find you again. I'm not running anymore. He left. Clara May stood at the counter and gripped the edge of it until Boyd appeared at her elbow. You all right? He asked quietly. I need to get back, she said. I'll explain on the way. She told Boyd everything on the ride back to the ranch. Not all of it, not the worst of it, not the specifics she still could not say out loud, without her hands starting to shake, but enough. Edmund, Boston. 3 years of a marriage that had been a prison with nice furniture. The way she'd left in the middle of the night with nothing but what she could carry, including a wooden box with a sourdough starter inside, because even in the worst moment of her life, she had thought clearly enough to bring the one living thing that had never failed her. Boyd listened without interrupting. That was a quality she had come to appreciate in him deeply. 45 days, he said when she finished. I need money, more than I'm making as a cook. How much more? I need $1,000 in 45 days on a $50 a month salary. Boyd was quiet for a moment. You got a plan. Patsy Howell's been selling my bread off her counter, Clara May said. She told me last week she can't keep it stocked. The hotel's been asking, so have 3 of the mining camps. If I bake more significantly more and sell wholesale, I can make up the difference. She paused. But I need to use the ranch kitchen, and I need Hank to agree. Boyd looked at her sideways. Good luck with that. She went to Hank that evening after supper after Lily had gone upstairs, and Boyd had made himself scarce with the particular tact of a man who knew when a conversation needed fewer witnesses. Hank was in his office. Ledgers opened the expression on his face that she had come to recognize as his version of worry, not agitated, but very still, like a man trying to hold a great weight without letting it show in his posture. I need to talk to you, she said from the doorway. Then talk. She laid it out plainly. The plan, the numbers, the 45 days. She did not tell him about Edmund because she was not ready to hand that information to anyone who hadn't yet proved they deserved it. She said she had a debt. She said she needed to pay it fast. She said she wanted to use his kitchen to expand the bread business, and she would give him half the profits for the use of it. Hank listened with his hands flat on the desk. No, he said. Listen to what I'm proposing. I heard you. The answer is no. You're here to cook for this household, not to run a commercial operation out of my kitchen. It won't interfere with my duties. I'll work mornings before the household needs anything. Boyd can help me with deliveries when he goes to town. Boyd's got enough to do. Then I'll manage deliveries myself. She stepped into the room. She was tired and scared, and she did not have the energy for indirection. I'm asking for a chance, Mr. Dyer. Half the profits for the use of your kitchen and supplies. If it causes any problem at all, any disruption to this household, I'll stop immediately. What kind of debt does a baker rack up that needs $1,000 in 45 days? The kind I'd rather not discuss. He leaned back in his chair and looked at her with those flat, weathered eyes, and she could see him doing what he always did, not just looking at what was in front of him, but looking at what was behind it. He'd had 2 years of practice reading things people weren't saying. "You're running from something," he said. "Same as when you arrived. This is related." "Yes." "And if I help you, does it bring trouble to my door, to Lily?" Clara May held his gaze. "I'm doing everything I can to make sure it doesn't." "That's not the same as no." "No," she said quietly. "It's not. But it's the truth, and I'd rather give you that than a comfortable lie." The silence sat between them. Outside, a wind had picked up, moving through the grass around the house with a sound like breathing. "Half the profits," Hank said finally. "Your regular duties don't slip. And if this brings one single problem to this property, it won't. It better not." She started baking at 3 in the morning instead of 4. 6 loaves for the house, then 12 for sale, then 18. The general store could not keep them on the shelves. Patsy Howell started putting out a sign on Tuesdays and Fridays, fresh bread from Hardin Ranch, and men lined up before she even opened the door. The hotel took everything Clara May could spare. 2 mining camps agreed to a standing weekly order. Her body protested loudly. The permanent ache between her shoulder blades deepened into something that woke her if she slept wrong. Her hands, which had just healed from the first week's scrubbing, split open again along the knuckles from the constant kneading. She slept 4 hours a night, and woke still tired, and went back to work because there was no other direction. Lily noticed. "Your hands are bleeding again," the girl said one morning, watching Clara May shape a loaf with fingers wrapped in strips of cloth. "They're fine." "They're not fine. They're bleeding." "Then they're bleeding fine." Clara May glanced at her. "Hand me that bowl." Lily handed her the bowl, but she didn't drop the subject, which Clara May was coming to understand was characteristic. For a child who'd said nothing for 2 years, she had opinions, and she was not shy about sharing them, now that she'd decided sharing was something she was willing to do. "Why are you working so hard?" Lily asked. "Because something needs doing. Boyd says you're baking enough bread for 3 towns. Boyd talks too much." "Boyd says that too," Lily said. A pause. "Are you in trouble?" Clara. May looked at her. 8 years old with eyes that had seen more than 8 years' worth of the world. She deserved something real. "A little," Clara May said. "But I'm working my way out of it. Papa could help." "Your papa is already helping." She started the next loaf. "Some things a person has to solve herself, Lily. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. You understand that." Lily was quiet for a moment. "Mama used to say that when things get hard, you have to get harder." Clara May's hands paused in the dough. "She sounds like she was very wise," she said. She was. Lily's voice was small and even, and carrying more weight than it should have to carry. "I miss her. But I'm glad you're here. Is that bad?" "No, sweetheart." Clara May kept her eyes on the dough because she didn't trust her face right now. "That's not bad at all. That's just being alive." By the end of the 3rd week, she had $210 in the tin she kept tucked behind the flour barrel. She needed $790 more in 24 days. The numbers kept her company at night. When she lay awake in the narrow bed listening to the ranch settle around her, the old wood of the house contracting in the cold, the cattle shifting in the pasture. She was standing at the stove one morning in the 4th week, stirring something that had long since stopped needing stirring, because she needed something to do with her hands, while her mind raced when she heard Hank's boots in the doorway. She didn't turn. She had gotten so accustomed to the sound of his presence that she no longer felt the instinctive flinch she'd felt the first week, the old reflex that said a man's footstep behind you was a thing to brace against. That was something she had not expected this place to give her. The slow, unremarkable return of a body that did not live in permanent anticipation of pain. "You're swaying," he said. "I'm not swaying." "You're swaying." He moved past her, took the spoon out of her hand with a matter-of-factness that left no room for argument, set it down, and turned her by the shoulder to face him. She let him because she was too tired not to. "When did you last sleep more than 3 hours?" "I sleep fine. I can see you from the kitchen window when I come in from the early check," he said. "Your light goes on at 3 and it doesn't go off. That's not sleeping fine." She wanted to argue and found she didn't have it in her. "I have 24 days, she said, "and I'm still 300 short." "How much did you need total?" She hadn't told him the amount, hadn't told him about Chet or the deadline or any of the specific shape of the trouble. She'd told him only that there was debt and that she needed time. $1,000, she said. He was quiet. 300 short, she said again. "If I can get through this week's orders and next week's, I'll be close. I just need $300. She looked up at him. He was watching her with that expression she had come to know not soft, but open, the look of a man deciding to trust something his own instincts couldn't entirely verify. "Hank." "It's a loan," he said. "Against future profits. You pay it back when you can." "I can't let you." "You can." His voice was even. "You want to know why? Because my daughter ate dinner at the table last night and told me a joke she heard from Boyd, and I can't remember the last time she told me anything, Clara May." Something moved through his face fast and deep. "She's healing. I can see it happening. And it's because of you and that kitchen, and the fact that you treat her like a person who deserves to take up space in the world." He paused. "So yes, $300. Whatever's chasing you, we make it go away, and then we figure out the rest." Clara May stood in the warm kitchen with flour on her hands and exhaustion in every joint, and something happening in her chest that she did not have a clean word for. Not gratitude, not relief, not love exactly, though it lived in the same neighborhood as all three. She had spent 3 years in a house where asking for help had been a weakness that was punished. She had spent 6 days on a coach learning to need nothing from anyone. She had arrived at this ranch certain that the only reliable thing in the world was her own 2 hands and a living starter in a wooden box. She was being asked to let that certainty be wrong. "All right," she said. He handed her the money the next morning. Cash from a locked box in his office, counted out without drama or ceremony, pressed into her hand like it was simply a practical matter between people who had agreed on the terms. She met Chet Pruitt at the general store 5 days before his deadline. She counted out every dollar on Patsy Howell's counter, with Chet watching, and Patsy pretending not to watch, and the whole transaction carrying the particular charged quality of things that are being witnessed without being acknowledged. "Smart woman," Chet said, pocketing it. "Edmund never appreciated what he had," he added, which was the closest thing to sympathy she supposed a man like him could manage. "Edmund never saw me as a person," Clara May said. She looked him in the eye. "If he hears from you, I will make absolutely certain that every person between here and Boston knows you took money to hide the location of a woman running from her abuser. Think about how that story travels." Chet's smile went small and careful. "You've changed." "Yes," Clara May said. "I have." She walked back to the ranch with empty pockets and a full heart, and the road under her boots felt different than it had the first day she'd walked it, more solid, more hers-like ground she had actually earned the right to stand on. Spring moved into summer, and the bread business kept growing. She paid Hank back in 6 weeks. She started putting the rest away in the tin, watching it build toward something she didn't have a name for yet, but recognized as future. Lily laughed sometimes now, a short surprised sound like she was still getting used to the fact that laughter was something she was allowed. Boyd had taken to eating lunch at the kitchen table every day, instead of out in the yard, ostensibly for convenience, but actually, Clara May suspected because the kitchen had become the warmest room on the property, in every sense that word could carry. And Hank. Hank was not a man who changed quickly, or declared himself, or made gestures. But he had begun to linger in doorways a few minutes longer than strictly necessary. He had started asking her opinion on things, ranch matters, supply decisions, whether the east fence was worth repairing, or needed to be rebuilt entirely. Small things. But a man who asks your opinion is a man who has decided your mind is worth consulting, and that in Clara May's experience was not a small thing at all. She did not let herself think too far ahead. She had learned the hard way that the future was not a place you could visit before you'd earned the present, and she was still earning this one day by day, loaf by loaf, in the kitchen of a broken ranch that was very slowly, and without making a fuss about it, becoming something that felt remarkably like home. She was in town on a supply run when she first heard the name Harlan Weston. Patsy said it the way people said names that carry weather with them, low and careful, with a glance toward the door. "He's been buying up land all through the valley," Patsy said. "Sent a man out to the Kimball place last month. They sold inside a week. The Greers held out longer, but—" She shook her head. "He's got ways of making people feel like they don't have a choice." "What kind of ways?" Clara May asked. Patsy looked at her. "The kind that are hard to prove," she said, "but easy to feel." Clara May carried that information home the way she carried anything that smelled like trouble, quietly in the back of her mind, turning it over while her hands did other things. She was still turning it over 3 days later when a man in an expensive suit rode up the Hardin Ranch Drive on a horse that cost more than most families made in a year, and she watched from the kitchen window as Hank walked out of the barn to meet him, and the whole shape of the conversation, the wide proprietary gesture the suited man made toward the hills, the way Hank's shoulders went rigid, the stillness that came into his body like a door closing, told her everything she needed to know before she heard a single word. The trouble, it turned out, had not finished finding her yet. It had simply been waiting its turn. She stayed at the window long enough to understand the shape of it, then went back to her bread because the bread still needed her, even when everything else was falling apart, and she had learned that keeping your hands busy was sometimes the only way to keep your head clear. Hank came inside 20 minutes later. She heard him stop in the hallway. Heard the particular quality of his stillness, not the stillness of a man gathering himself, but the stillness of a man who has just been told something that knocked the floor out from under him and is standing very carefully on what's left. She poured coffee and set it on the table without being asked. He sat down. He wrapped both hands around the cup. He stared at it. "Harlan Weston," he said. "I heard the name in town 3 days ago," Clara May said. She sat down across from him. "Patsy Howell. She said he's been buying up land through the valley. Said he has ways of making people feel like they don't have a choice." Hank's jaw tightened. "He wants the ranch." "What did he offer?" $15,000. His voice was flat. "Says the railroad's coming through. Says smart ranchers are selling now and getting good prices. Says stubborn ones tend to regret it." "Is that a threat?" "He called it a timeline." Hank set the cup down. "He's also claiming there's a water rights dispute. Says there's a county filing from 1867 that puts the creek access under county jurisdiction, not mine. Says without clear water rights, I can't run cattle. Says without cattle, no ranch," Clara May said. "He gave me until end of September to reconsider." Hank's hands were flat on the table now, pressing down like he needed to feel something solid. "My great-grandfather built this place. My grandfather nearly lost it twice and fought to keep it both times. My father broke his back on this land." He stopped. 15,000 sounds like a lot, until you know this property's worth 3 times that minimum. "He's not buying," Clara May said. "He's stealing, just doing it with paperwork instead of a gun." Hank looked at her sharply. "It's what men with money do," she said. "They find the complicated language that makes simple theft sound legal. They count on the person being threatened not knowing enough to fight back." She paused. "Do you have your original land grant? The document your great-grandfather received when he was first deeded the property?" "Somewhere. My father handled all the paperwork. It's probably buried in the office under 20 years of everything else. We need to find it." "Why?" "Because if your great-grandfather was granted this land before 1867, his water rights would be written into that original grant. Any county filing after the fact wouldn't supersede it." She met his eyes. "My father was a land office clerk. I grew up reading property documents. I know what to look for. Hank stared at her. You never mentioned that. You never asked about my life before? She said it without accusation. It was simply true. I'm not just a woman who showed up with bruises and a sourdough starter, Hank. I had a whole existence before this place. Some of it is actually useful. Something shifted in his face. Not quite the crack she'd seen before, but a deepening of it, like a man revising a story he'd been telling himself and finding the new version more complicated and more interesting than the old one. If I find the land grant, he said slowly, you think you can read it? Tell me what we're dealing with. I can try. Boyd came in from the fields at noon, took one look at both their faces and sat down without being invited. Clara May poured him coffee and told him the situation in the same flat, factual voice she'd used with Hank. Boyd listened the way he always listened, completely, without interrupting, storing everything. Weston, he said when she finished. He bought out the Greers last spring. You know what he paid them. What? Hank asked. $12,000. For 400 acres with a working well and a house that was built solid. Boyd's voice had gone hard in a way she hadn't heard from him before. They had water trouble too, right before he made the offer. Funny how that works. The three of them sat with that for a moment. He manufactures the problem, Clara May said. Then he offers himself as the solution. Can we fight him? Boyd asked. With what? Hank said. I've got maybe $1,800 in the bank. A lawyer would burn through that in a month, and that's assuming I could find one willing to go up against Weston. He owns half the county, probably including the judge. Find the land grant first, Clara May said. Then we decide what we're fighting with. They searched that night. All three of them after Lily was in bed, Clara May and Hank in the office. Boyd in the back storage room where older boxes had been pushed and forgotten over decades. The office smelled like old paper and lamp oil, and the filing system, if it could be called that, was essentially the accumulated archaeology of 3 generations of a family that had been too busy working the land to organize the documents that proved they owned it. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, bills of sale for cattle long dead, tax receipts for equipment that had rusted into the ground. Photographs, she tried not to look too closely at those, tried not to see the woman in them. The dark-haired woman with Lily's eyes, who smiled like she had never once doubted that the world was fundamentally good. That's Sarah, Hank said quietly when he caught Clara May's gaze moving toward one of the photographs, despite her best effort. She was beautiful, Clara May said. She was the best person I ever knew. He said it simply without performance. Lily has her eyes, same way of looking at things, like she's deciding whether you're worth trusting, and she hasn't made up her mind yet. She gets there eventually, Clara May said. The trusting. She does. He was quiet for a moment. She got there with you faster than I would have believed. Clara May said nothing. She went back to the papers. At midnight, Boyd called from the storage room. Not loudly. Boyd was not a loud man when things were serious, but with the particular quality of someone who has found exactly what they were looking for and is being careful with it. The land grant was at the bottom of a trunk that had been sitting undisturbed long enough to smell like the past had physical form. The paper was heavy, formal, marked with official seals dated April 1851. Clara May took it to the lamp and read it through once, then again, then a third time, checking specific language, specific provisions. This is ironclad, she said. Hank was standing 2 feet away. She could feel the tension in him, the way you feel weather coming, a pressure in the air that hadn't been there before. Read it to me, he said. She read the relevant sections aloud. The grant of 640 acres to Elias Hardin Dyer and his heirs. The specific language about water sources, all water sources therein natural and established to be held in perpetuity by the grantee and his successors. The date, the signatures, the territorial seal. Any county filing from 1867 doesn't matter, she said. This predates it by 16 years, and it specifically grants water rights as part of the property. Weston's bluffing. He's hoping you don't have the documentation to call him on it. Hank took the grant from her hands and held it the way you hold something you had given up expecting to find. He read it himself, slowly moving his lips slightly the way people do when they're reading something they need to be absolutely certain about. "I need to get this recorded at the county office," he said. "Make it official. Make it public." "First thing tomorrow," Clara May said. "If Weston sees me do it." "Good. Let him see. Let him understand that you know exactly what he's trying to do." She crossed her arms. "Men like that are counting on your fear. The moment you show them you're not afraid, or even just that you're informed, it changes the calculation." Boyd leaned in the doorway. "I'll ride with you," he said to Hank. "Safety in numbers." Hank looked between them, and Clara May saw something happen in his face that she had not seen there yet. Not hope exactly, because hope was something this man had learned to be careful with, but the beginning of something that might become hope if it was given enough room to grow. Something that looked like a man remembering that he did not have to carry everything by himself. "All right," he said. They rode out at first light, Hank with the land grant folded carefully in his coat pocket. Clara May stayed at the ranch with Lily, who had come downstairs to find the kitchen unusually quiet, and had looked at Clara May with those measuring eyes until Clara May had said simply, "Your papa's taking care of something important." And Lily had nodded once and climbed onto her stool. They made bread together. The rhythm of it was settling in a way that went past habit, the way Lily's hands moved now with confidence in the familiar steps, the way she knew without being told when the dough needed more flour, the way she'd started humming sometimes while she worked small and under her breath, like she was still testing whether sound was safe and finding each time that it was. "Are you worried?" Lily asked. "A little?" Clara May said. "But worry doesn't help bread rise, so I'm choosing to focus on what my hands can do right now." "Is that something your grandma taught you?" "That and about 100 other things." Clara May shaped the dough. She used to say that the best thing about baking is that it insists on the present. You can't be in the past while you're watching a loaf because the loaf will burn. You can't be in the future either because the future depends on what you're doing right now. Lily considered this with the seriousness she brought to most ideas. "I think about the future sometimes," she said. "About what it'll be like when I'm grown." "What do you see?" "I don't know yet." She paused. "But you're in it, and Papa, and Boyd." Another pause smaller. "Is that okay to say?" "That is very okay to say." Hank returned at midday. He came into the kitchen and stood at the door, and the look on his face told her before he said a word that it had not gone cleanly. "Grants filed," he said. "County clerk verified it, recorded it, made it official. Water rights are secure." "But," Boyd said from his position at the table, "Weston was at the county office when I got there." Hank pulled out his chair and sat down heavily. "Didn't say anything. Just watched me file with this expression like he already knew the next move and I didn't." He accepted the coffee Clara May poured. "One of his men stopped me on the way out. Said Weston wants a meeting, tomorrow noon at the Thornfield Hotel." "That's a trap," Boyd said immediately. "Probably." "Then we all go," Clara May said. Hank looked at her. "I'm not dragging you into... You're not dragging me anywhere." She set her cup down. "I've seen men like Weston Hank. I know exactly how they run a room. They rely on having the only informed person be themselves. They rely on the other party being isolated, uncertain, and too polite to call the performance what it is." She met his eyes steadily. "I won't be polite." Boyd was already nodding. "She's right. Weston's the kind of man who needs witnesses to behave like something other than what he actually is. Show up with people and he can't control the room the same way." Hank looked between them for a long moment. "Lily stays here," he said finally. "With Mrs. Hargrove from the East Farm." "Agreed," Clara May said. They arranged it that evening. Mrs. Hargrove was a solid, no-nonsense woman who had known Hank since before Sarah died and had the particular quality of reliability that comes from a person who has never in their life done less than what they said they would do. Lily accepted the arrangement without argument, which told Clara May more about how clearly the child understood the stakes than any amount of questioning would have. "Be careful," Lily said to Clara May quietly when the others weren't listening. "Always," Clara May said. "No," Lily said, and her voice had the weight of someone who has thought about this. "I mean specifically careful, not generally careful, actually careful." Clara May looked at her. "Yes, ma'am," she said. Lily gave a short, satisfied nod, as though this was the correct response, and went to get her coat for the walk to Mrs. Hargrove's. The Thornfield Hotel was the grandest building in Hardin Creek, which was not saying a great deal, but it said enough. It said money and influence, and the assumption that both of those things settled arguments before they started. Harlan Weston was already seated when they arrived, finishing what appeared to be a very expensive lunch, with the unhurried ease of a man who had never once in his life needed to rush anything because the world had always waited for him. He was older than Clara May had expected, closer to 60 than 50, with silver hair and the particular handsomeness of men who have spent their lives being looked at and have made peace with enjoying it. His suit cost more than she earned in 3 months. His eyes, when they moved to her, were the pale, assessing gray of a man who calculated everything that walked into his vicinity and had very rarely been surprised by the results. "Mr. Ashford." He gestured toward the chairs across from him. "And you've brought reinforcements. How democratic." His gaze settled on Clara May. "I don't believe we've met." "Clara May Sutton. I work at the ranch." "Ah." Something moved through his expression, not quite interest, but its cousin. "The baker. I've heard about your bread. Half the town apparently can't stop talking about it." A thin smile. "Very enterprising, starting a business on someone else's property. I pay Mr. Dyer for the use of his kitchen and supplies," she said. "Everything's above board." "I'm certain it is." He turned to Hank with the smooth pivot of a man who had already decided she was not worth more than 30 seconds of attention. "I understand you filed your land grant yesterday. Very thorough." "I was protecting what's mine," Hank said. "Of course." Weston leaned back. "Though I have to say, a land grant is a wonderful thing for establishing historical ownership. It doesn't, however, address current financial obligations." He reached into his jacket and produced a folded document with the careful, deliberate movement of a man who had rehearsed this. "The First National Bank has brought something to my attention. A promissory note from 1882, a loan taken out by your father, $2,500, at 6% interest compounding annually, never discharged." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Boyd spoke first. "That loan was settled. Do you have documentation?" Weston's voice was pleasant. "Because the bank's records show no record of payment." He slid the document across the table. "The current amount owed with 4 decades of compounding interest is $41,673. Clara May looked at the number. She looked at the document. She looked at Weston's face, the careful neutrality of it. The performance of regret, the slight hardening around the eyes that was the only tell a man this practiced would allow himself. Something was wrong with the paper. She could not have said immediately what it was, only that she felt it the way you feel a word that's been spelled incorrectly before you can identify which letter is wrong. A wrongness in the whole shape of it. The paper was too clean for something 44 years old. The ink had a faint sheen at the edges that suggested it hadn't had sufficient time to settle into the fiber. She had seen Edmund do this, not with ranches, but with her signing her name to accounts she hadn't opened, creating paper trails she hadn't made using documentation to build a reality that bore no resemblance to the actual one. She knew what manufactured evidence looked like when you knew to look for it. "I can't pay that," Hank said. His voice had gone careful and controlled in the way voices go when a man is fighting to keep what's underneath it from showing. "I know," Weston said. "Which is why I'm prepared to be generous. Sell me the ranch for $20,000. I settle the debt with the bank. You walk away with enough to start over. Everyone wins." "Everyone wins except the man who loses his family's land for half its value," Clara May said. Weston's eyes moved to her with a quality that had not been there a moment ago, something colder, more deliberate. "Miss Sutton, this is a private business matter. It stopped being private the moment you walked onto that ranch." "You're new here," he said, and his voice had dropped half a register in a way that was clearly intended to carry a message. "So I'll educate you. This valley operates on certain principles. People who understand those principles do well. People who don't." He paused. "Well, they tend to find things considerably more difficult." "Is that a threat?" Hank said. "It's an observation." Weston stood straightening his jacket with the unhurried precision of a man who had already decided this conversation was over. "You have until the end of September. I'd encourage you to think carefully, Mr. Dyer. Think about your daughter. A failing ranch is no environment for a child." He nodded once at no one in particular and walked out. The three of them sat in the silence he left behind. "The promissory note is forged," Clara May said. Both men looked at her. "I can't prove it's sitting here," she said. "But it's wrong. The paper is wrong, the ink is wrong. A document from 1882 doesn't look like that. The stock is too uniform, too clean. And the ink has a sheen it wouldn't have if it had been sitting in a file for 40 years. She kept her voice level. "Weston manufactured that debt. He's counting on Hank not having access to the original bank records to dispute it." Boyd was watching her carefully. "Can you prove it? Maybe. But proving it in court would cost money we don't have, and time we don't have either, and Weston probably has the judge anyway." She looked at the document on the table. "We don't need to prove it in court. We need to prove it to Weston. Make it clear we know what he's done. Make it a liability for him instead of a weapon." "How?" Hank asked. "The original bank records," she said. "If the loan was real, there would be a full paper trail application, approval documents, payment ledgers, discharge notices. If the note is forged, none of that exists in the original files. The only record will be whatever Weston had manufactured recently." She paused. "We need to see those records." Boyd was already shaking his head slowly. "The bank's not going to show us their files voluntarily. Not if Weston has the bank president in his pocket." "No," Clara May agreed. "They won't show us voluntarily." The silence that followed was the kind that happens when three people all arrive at the same conclusion at the same moment, and none of them particularly wants to be the first one to say it out loud. Hank leaned forward. "Clara May." "I know," she said. "Whatever you're thinking, I know." She folded her hands on the table. "Give me tonight to think it through properly. Don't do anything, don't say anything to anyone, just give me tonight." She spent that night at the kitchen table with the lamp burning low, turning the problem, the way she turned dough, finding the places where it resisted, working at them steadily, not forcing, but not yielding either. The starter bubbled quietly beside her elbow, 100 years old, and still doing its work. And she thought about what her grandmother had told her once about the difference between problems that looked unsolvable and problems that were actually unsolvable. Most of them, her grandmother had said, just need you to find the door instead of walking at the wall. She found the door at 2 in the morning, and she sat back and looked at what it would require of her, the risk of it, the potential consequences, the sheer audacity of it. And then she looked at the starter in its jar, living proof that stubborn things could survive almost anything if they were tended with enough care and enough refusal to give up. She went to bed. She did not sleep much. But what sleep she got was the sleep of a woman who has made a decision and is at peace with it, which was a better quality of rest than she'd had in weeks. In the morning, she found Hank already in the kitchen, coffee made, hands flat on the table, waiting. "Tell me," he said. She told him. He stared at her for a long time after she finished. Outside, the first light was coming up over the eastern hills, the kind of pale gold that made everything look temporarily possible. "That's insane," he said. "Probably," she agreed. "You could go to prison." "Yes." "Weston could?" He stopped. "Men with that kind of money don't tolerate threats to their position, Clara May. They don't just make things legally difficult. They make things... Yo. I know what they make things," she said quietly. "I lived with one for 3 years, remember?" He held her gaze. She held it back. "I'm not doing this without you," she said. "I'm not asking permission, but I'd rather do it with you beside me than alone. I've done enough things alone. Something moved through Hank Dyer's face that she did not entirely have words for. Not just the decision to say yes, but something underneath the decision, something about the specific quality of being chosen by someone who has every reason to handle things alone, and is choosing deliberately not to. "Boyd's going to say we're out of our minds," he said. "Boyd's going to help anyway," she said. Hank almost smiled. It was close enough. "Yeah," he said. "He will." Boyd did say they were out of their minds. He said it twice, actually, the first time, when Hank laid out the plan over breakfast, and the second time 20 minutes later, when he'd had enough coffee to fully process the details. Then he asked 3 practical questions about timing and access and how they intended to handle the night watchman. And when Clara May told him there was no night watchman budget cuts, he himself had mentioned it weeks ago, complaining that the town had gotten cheap about security. Boyd set down his cup, looked at the ceiling for a moment, and said, "All right, but we do this right or we don't do it." That was Boyd. Clara May had come to understand that his easy manner and his ready smile were not signs of a man who took things lightly. They were the surface of a man who had simply decided a long time ago that worry was not a useful tool, and that when something needed doing, you figured out how to do it properly, and then you did it. There was a janitor at the First National Bank named Miguel Reyes. Boyd knew him the way Boyd seemed to know everyone in a 30-mile radius. Not intimately, but solidly. The kind of knowing that comes from years of showing up at the same church and the same feed store and the same occasional Saturday evening at the saloon, where serious men drank moderately and talked about practical things. Miguel had keys to every part of the bank except the vault itself. He was a reliable man with 6 children and a wife who stretched every dollar until it had nothing left to give. "His youngest needs surgery," Boyd said. "Something with her hip. The family's been trying to save for it for 2 years, and they're still short." "How much?" Clara May asked. $200 would change everything for them. She nodded. "Offer him 200. 1 hour with the keys starting at 7 o'clock. He goes to his sister's place 2 towns over for the evening, so he has an alibi, and tomorrow morning when anyone asks, he spent the whole night there." Boyd looked at her. "You've thought about this kind of thing before." "I've thought about survival before," she said. "The specifics vary." Miguel agreed the same afternoon. Boyd came back with the keys wrapped in a piece of cloth and the information that the janitor would leave them under the back step of the bank at 6:30 and expected them back before 7:30 without fail. 1 hour. His expression when Boyd described the arrangement had apparently been the expression of a man who had decided some risks were worth their weight in the right currency. That left 1 full day to wait, which was the hardest part of any plan, not the execution, but the hours before it when your mind had nothing to do but locate every possible way the thing could go wrong. Clara May baked. She baked the way she always baked when things were difficult, not frantically, not as distraction, but with the deliberate attention that her grandmother had taught her was the whole point. She made 4 loaves for the house, 2 dozen for the week's orders, a batch of honey rolls because Lily had mentioned them 3 days ago, in the offhand way children mention things they want without quite asking. She let the kitchen be what it had always been for her, the one place where the work was honest, and the outcome, if you were careful and patient, was almost always good. Lily helped in the mornings the way she always did, and Clara May noticed the girl watching her with more than usual attention tracking something she couldn't quite name. "You're not worried today," Lily said. It wasn't a question. "I'm always a little worried." "No." Lily shook her head certain. "Yesterday you were worried. Today you're different. Like when you're waiting for bread to come out of the oven and you already know it's going to be good." Clara May looked at her for a moment. This child who had spent 2 years learning to read rooms and people and the specific emotional weather of everyone around her, because when you couldn't speak, you learned to see. "I made a decision," Clara May said. "Decisions are easier to carry than uncertainty." Lily thought about this. What kind of decision? The kind that might fix things. She handed her a spoon. "Stir that for me." That evening, after Lily was in bed, the 3 of them gathered in the kitchen. Clara May had dark clothes laid out. Hank had a lantern he'd modified with wooden panels that directed the light downward in a narrow beam. Boyd had the keys still wrapped in their cloth. "We go over it once more," Clara May said, "and then we go." They went over it. She talked through the filing system she expected to find, organized by year, then by document type, which was standard practice in territorial banks of that era. Established by the federal guidelines, her father had kept pinned above his desk for the 20 years he'd worked as a land office clerk. They needed the 1882 files. They were looking for anything bearing Elias Dyer's name: loan applications, promissory notes, ledger entries, discharge documents. If the original loan had been real and paid off, there would be a satisfied notation on the original note, a discharge letter, and corresponding ledger entries. If Weston's note was the only document, it confirmed the forgery. "We don't take anything," she said. "We document what we find. I have Mrs. Howell's Kodak." She'd borrowed it that afternoon under the pretext of wanting to photograph the bread for a newspaper inquiry, and Patsy had handed it over without hesitation. "We photograph the evidence, we replace everything exactly as we found it, and we leave." "And if someone's there," Boyd said, "then we deal with it." Clara May looked at both of them. "I'm not going to pretend this is without risk. But I need you both to understand something. If we don't do this, Weston wins. He takes the ranch for half its value using a document he manufactured, and there is nothing legal or otherwise that we can do about it, because we have no proof and no money to fight him in a court he already owns." She paused. "This is the door. I've looked for every other door, and this is the one that's there." Hank held her gaze. Then he stood, picked up the lantern, and said, "Let's go." The ride into town was quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't emptiness but density. 3 people carrying the weight of what they're about to do, and choosing not to put it into words because words would make it more real than it needed to be yet. Hardin Creek, at 7 in the evening, was mostly indoors. Supper lamplight, the ordinary business of families settling into their evenings. The bank stood at the corner of Main and River Street, brick-faced and solid dark in every window. The back step was where Miguel had promised, and the keys were under it exactly as described. The lock turned without sound. The door opened. They went in. The back office was narrow and smelled like old paper and metal and the particular dry cold of a room where windows were never opened. Filing cabinets lined 2 walls labeled in faded ink with date ranges. Clara May moved to them, immediately reading the labels by the narrow beam of Hank's modified lantern. Boyd positioned himself near the door, watching and listening. She found the 1882 drawer on her second try. Pulled it open carefully. Cataloged what she saw: commercial loans, personal accounts, property transfers. She started with personal loans and moved through the files with the speed of someone who had grown up doing this. Her father standing over her shoulder in the land office, teaching her how documents talk to each other, how the absence of something was sometimes as informative as its presence. "What am I looking for exactly?" Hank asked low. "Anything with your father's name, or your grandfather's Elias Dyer. If the loan was real, the application would have been filed before the note was signed. Look for anything dated earlier than August 1882. They worked in the narrow lamplight, the only sound the soft movement of paper and their own careful breathing. 10 minutes. 15. Clara May's confidence was beginning to develop a small cold crack at its center, the fear that Weston had been thorough enough to create a complete false trail that they would find nothing because he had manufactured everything they would look for. Then Hank made a sound, not quite a word, the sound a man makes when something lands. He was holding a folder. The label read, Dyer Property Historical. Inside, organized by date, was the complete record of 3 generations of the Dyer family's relationship with this bank. Land transfers, tax payments, equipment loans all discharged. And at the very back, behind a paper-clipped bundle of receipts, a promissory note dated August 1882. The same note Weston had shown them. Except this one was original. The paper had yellowed the way paper yellows when it has actually lived through 40 years. The ink had faded into the fiber not sitting on top of it, and stamped across the face of it in red ink that had gone rust-colored with age was a single word. Satisfied. Below it, in a clerk's careful handwriting discharged in full March 1891, signed and witnessed. Weston had created a duplicate. Removed the satisfaction stamp, presented a document that looked like the original, and counted on Hank never seeing the one that was filed here in the back of a folder no one had opened in 40 years. "He lied," Hank said. His voice was very quiet and very even, and it carried underneath it something that Clara May recognized as a specific kind of anger, not hot but cold and absolute. The anger of a man who has been told his father was a failure and has just found proof that it was a lie. "He lied," she confirmed. She was already raising the Kodak. "Don't move it. Hold the lantern steady." She photographed the satisfied note, the folder label, the date range of the file. The discharge entry in the ledger. She found 2 folders over a clear formal record of the loan being paid in full, 17 years before Weston claimed it had never been paid at all. She worked quickly and methodically, and when she had everything she needed, she replaced every document exactly where she had found it, closed the drawer, and checked the room once more with the lantern. "Ready," she said. Boyd reached for the back door. It didn't move. He tried again. The handle turned, but the door held. He looked at Clara May. "It locked itself when we pulled it closed." "The key," she said. "We need the key to open it from inside." The key was in the exterior lock, on the outside of the door, where it had been when they'd used it to enter and where it had remained when they'd pulled the door shut behind them. For 3 seconds, no one said anything. Then from the front of the building came the unmistakable sound of a key in the front door lock. Hank killed the lantern. The dark was immediate and total. Clara May felt Boyd move, felt Hank's hand find her arm, and then they were moving not toward the back door, but toward the supply closet. She had noted when they'd first come in on the left wall, a narrow door she'd cataloged automatically, the way she cataloged everything, because she had spent 3 years learning that knowing your exits was not paranoia, it was survival. The closet door opened inward. They pressed into the back of it, all 3 of them, and pulled it shut to a crack. Lamplight under the office door. Footsteps, deliberate, unhurried. A person who had every right to be in this building at this hour and knew it. The office door opened. Harlan Weston walked in. Clara May felt Hank go absolutely still beside her. She pressed her hand against his arm once, firm, steady. "Wait." Weston moved to the filing cabinet. He moved with the ease of a man who had been here before and knew where everything was, which meant either he had an arrangement with the bank beyond simple friendship, or he had come here previously to place what they had just found and wanted to ensure it remained undisturbed. He opened the 1882 drawer, reached in. His hand moved through the folder they had just replaced. He paused. Clara May's heart was very loud. Weston withdrew his hand. He turned slowly, holding the lamp at shoulder height, and scanned the room with eyes that were not the eyes of a man who was simply checking on something. They were the eyes of a man who sensed a change in the quality of the air. "I know someone's here," he said, conversationally, the way a man speaks when he is comfortable with the power of the position he is in. The lamp on the back table is still warm, and Miguel's keys are not where he typically leaves them. He set his own lamp on the desk, reached into his coat. In the thin light metal caught. "I'll count to 3. If you're not out before then, I start shooting through doors and let the sheriff sort out the details in the morning." 1. Hank's hand found hers in the dark. 2. Clara May stepped out of the closet. Weston's expression did not change, which told her he was either unsurprised or very good at appearing to be. His gun hand dropped to his side, but did not put the weapon away. "Miss Sutton," he said, "I should have expected someone with your particular set of qualities." His eyes moved to the closet door. "And Mr. Dyer, I presume?" Hank stepped out. Boyd came last. Weston looked at all 3 of them, with the unhurried assessment of a man reviewing a problem he has already solved. "Breaking and entering," he said. "Possibly theft, depending on what you found and whether you took anything. That's prison time at minimum. Serious prison time." He moved to the chair behind the desk and sat the gun resting on his knee, aimed at no one in particular, and therefore at all of them. "Unless, of course, we make a different arrangement." "We're not making arrangements with you," Hank said. "Even to stay out of prison." Weston's voice was patient. Think about Lily, Mr. Dyer. What happens to her if her father goes to jail? She has no mother, no family to speak of. She'd go to county. He tilted his head. I'm offering you a way out of that. Sign over the ranch. I forget this happened. Everyone goes home. He produced a document from his inner pocket. Pre-prepared as Clara May had known it would be, men like Weston prepared their documents the way other men prepared their weapons in advance and thoroughly. Sign it now, Weston said, or I call the sheriff. Hank looked at the paper. She could see him calculating in that still interior way of his the cost of this against the cost of that, the math of a man trying to find the least damaging path through an impossible room. She could see the moment he started to move toward surrender. Not because he wanted to, because he thought it would protect them. There's another option, Clara May said. Weston looked at her with what might have been genuine curiosity. I'm listening. You call the sheriff. We all go through it together. She stepped forward, which was either brave or foolish, and she had stopped distinguishing between the two some time ago. Because if you do that and investigators start looking seriously at your business practices, what else do they find? How many other properties in this valley did you take using manufactured debts and forged documents? How many other families? She watched his eyes. You've built something here, Mr. Weston. Money, reputation, influence. One serious investigation and it all falls apart. Not just here, everywhere you've operated. No one will believe criminals over me. They might not, she said. But the Sacramento Gazette will find it interesting. The food critic who wrote about my bread 2 months ago, he and I have an understanding now. He's the kind of journalist who loves a story about a powerful man using fraud to steal from honest families. She kept her voice flat and factual. You shoot us, it becomes a murder investigation. You have us arrested, we talk to every newspaper between here and San Francisco. Either way, what you've built here starts coming apart at the seams. You're bluffing. I've already lost everything once, she said. Lost my home, my name, my safety. Started over with nothing in a place where nobody knew me. I am not afraid of losing things, Mr. Weston. You are. That is the difference between us. The silence stretched. She could hear her own heartbeat and chose not to let it show. Then the back door crashed open. Boyd had left the back window unlatched. She had told him to quietly when they were reviewing the plan, because she had known the door might be a problem, and the man who came through it was not anyone Weston had been expecting. Miguel's brother-in-law, it turned out, was a man named Alonzo, who was large and steady, and had been waiting in the alley for 45 minutes at Boyd's request, along with 2 ranch hands from the Hardin property, and Patsy Howell's husband, who was not a large man, but was a very determined one. Drop it, Boyd said, coming through right behind Alonzo. His rifle was at his shoulder. I will not be theatrical about this. I will simply shoot. Weston looked at the rifle, at the men behind it, at his own suddenly very poor arithmetic, and slowly placed the gun on the desk. In the quiet that followed, Clara May became aware that her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs, and looked at Weston with the clarity that comes after adrenaline starts to ebb that particular clean-eyed view of a moment that has just turned. Here is what happens now, she said. You withdraw your claim on the Dyer Ranch. You inform the bank that the promissory note was an error on your part, and direct them to close the matter. You leave this valley, and you leave these people alone. She paused. Or the photographs I took tonight of the satisfied original note, along with signed testimony from everyone in this room about what you just admitted to go to every newspaper and every territorial court west of the Mississippi. You photographed. Weston stopped. Something moved through his face that she suspected was the closest thing to genuine surprise the man had experienced in years. My father was a land office clerk, she said. I know how documents work. I know what evidence looks like. And I know that a man in your position cannot afford the specific story that evidence tells. Boyd's cousin, it emerged later, had been writing in a notebook in the corner the entire time. Every word. Clara May had not arranged that part. That part had been Boyd, who had understood without being told, without discussion, that documentation was the whole point. Weston sat with the shape of his defeat for a long moment. He was a man who had operated for years in the space between what was legal and what was provable, and he understood with the cold clarity of experience when that space had closed around him. "Fine," he said. It was not a gracious word. It was a word with teeth in it pointed inward. "One more thing," Clara May said. She crossed the room and took the pre-prepared document from the desk, the one he had brought for Hank to sign. She folded it twice and put it in her pocket. "I'll be keeping this, in case you forget the terms of our arrangement." They rode back to the ranch in the early hours of the morning, the sky beginning its slow shift from black toward something approaching possibility. Boyd rode ahead with Alonzo. Hank and Clara May came behind close enough that their horses occasionally drifted toward each other on the road. "You planned the backup," Hank said. "Not an accusation, something else." "I planned for contingencies," she said. "Weston is predictable. Men who've never been seriously opposed always are. They have a script and they run it, and they're not creative when it stops working. You were not scared." "I was terrified," she said. "I was terrified the entire time." He looked at her in the dark. "You didn't show it." "I've had practice not showing it." They rode in quiet for a while after that, the ranch appearing ahead of them, as the first pale suggestion of dawn came up over the eastern hills. "After this settles," Hank said, and then he stopped. She waited. "After this settles," he said again, more carefully, "I'd like to have a conversation about this." He gestured at the space between their horses in a way that was probably the least articulate gesture she had ever seen a grown man make, and which was for exactly that reason the most honest thing he had said to her yet. "All right," she said. "All right," he repeated like he was settling it in himself. They reached the ranch gate. The kitchen window was dark. Lily was asleep safe with Mrs. Hargrove in the next room. The starter was on the counter where she'd left it doing its patient ancient work. Clara May thought she had never in her life been so glad to be home. Then she heard the horse. Single rider coming fast from the south road, the direction that led out of town and connected if you followed it long enough and changed lines twice to a railroad that went east. All the way east. All the way if you were determined, and you had money, and you had been looking for someone for 4 months without success, and you had finally somehow found a thread to pull all the way to Boston. Boyd heard it too. She saw him pull up his horse and turn. The rider came into the lamplight of the gate, and Clara May knew him, before she could see his face knew him by the way he sat a horse by the angle of his shoulders, by the particular quality of authority he wore like a second skin. The authority of a man who had never once in his life doubted that what he wanted was coming to him, eventually if he was patient enough to wait. Edmund Hartwell had not been patient. He had been determined, which was worse. He pulled his horse to a stop 15 feet away and looked at her with the expression she remembered better than she wanted to. Not angry. Not yet. But the particular stillness that came before anger in him, the way a sky goes flat and quiet right before weather. "Mary," he said. She stood her ground. Her hands were steady. She was aware of Hank beside her, of Boyd behind her, of the darkness of the ranch at her back, and Lily sleeping inside it, and everything she had built over 4 months on this hard, beautiful, unforgiving ground. "My name is Clara May Sutton," she said. "And you need to hear very carefully what I'm about to tell you." Edmund Hartwell had the particular stillness of a man who had rehearsed this moment many times, and believed he already knew how it ended. That was the thing about men like him. They wrote the story in advance, and then expected the world to perform it on cue. He sat his horse in the lamplight with the patience of someone who had never genuinely been refused anything he wanted badly enough, and he looked at Clara May the way he had always looked at her, like she was a thing that had wandered out of its proper place and simply needed to be returned to it. "You look well," he said. "Wyoming agrees with you." "You need to leave," she said. "Mary, Clara May." Her voice did not waver. She had practiced this voice in the dark for 4 months without knowing she was practicing it. "You will call me by my name, or you will not speak to me at all." Something moved through Edmund's face, not quite anger yet, but the shadow that came before it, the sky-flattening quiet she had once learned to read, the way sailors read weather. He dismounted slowly, deliberately, the way men dismount when they want to communicate that they are in no hurry because they have already decided the outcome. "I have a court order," he said. He reached into his coat and produced the document with the same theatrical precision she had watched Weston use hours ago, and the similarity was so exact, so perfectly representative of a particular kind of man, that she almost laughed. Almost. A competency ruling from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It grants me authority to drag her back against her will, using a court that never heard her side, Hank said. Edmund looked at him for the first time. The look was the one Clara May knew well, the slow, dismissive assessment of a man who has decided within 3 seconds that he is dealing with something beneath his consideration. "And you are Hank Dyer. This is my ranch. That woman works for me and lives on my property, and I don't let anyone threaten my people." Hank's voice was level and absolute in the way of men who do not say things they don't mean. "So you're going to get back on that horse?" Edmund almost smiled. How very Western. "Threatening violence in defense of a woman you've known for what, a few months? I've been married to her for 3 years. I know exactly what she is." "You know what you made her believe she was," Clara May said. "That's different." He turned back to her, and now the patience was wearing thin at the edges. She could see it, the familiar tightening around his mouth, the slight shift in how he was holding his shoulders. Edmund Hartwell was a man who could maintain his performance for a long time, but underneath the performance was always the same thing. The absolute, unshakable conviction that his will was the organizing principle of any room he entered, and that anyone who contradicted it was simply confused about the nature of reality. "You stole from me when you left," he said. "The accounts were accounts you opened in my name without my knowledge," she said. "To debts I never agreed to." "I know how that works now, Edmund. I've spent 4 months learning exactly how men like you use paper to build cages." She took one step forward. She was aware of her own size, the breadth of her, the solid weight of a body that had worked hard and grown strong, and she let herself take up the space she occupied without apology, without the old reflex to make herself smaller. "I'm not confused. I'm not unstable. I'm not coming back. The court disagrees. The court didn't hear from me." She kept moving forward, slowly closing the distance between them, with the steadiness of someone who has made a decision all the way down to the bone. "I have a doctor in this town who has documented my injuries. I have 30 neighbors who know my name and my work and my character. I have witnesses to this conversation." She stopped 6 feet from him. "And I have 4 months of building something real, something that is mine, in a place where people judge you by what you do and not by what someone with money says about you." Edmund's jaw tightened. "You think these frontier people can protect you from a legal order issued by a Massachusetts court?" "I think you came 3,000 miles alone," she said. "Which tells me you don't have as much certainty about your legal position as you're performing. If you were certain, you'd have come with a marshal. You came by yourself because you were hoping I'd simply be afraid enough to go." The silence that followed had a specific quality, the silence of a man recalculating. Then Boyd's voice came from behind her, and it had entirely lost its easy warmth. "I've got a rifle, Mr. Hartwell. I want you to be aware of that before you reach for whatever you're considering reaching for." Edmund's hand, which had been moving toward his coat, went still. "There's also this," Clara May said. She reached into her own pocket and produced Mrs. Howell's camera, still loaded with the last exposure on the roll. "I've been documenting this conversation. What you'll want to remember is that I have photographs from tonight showing a powerful man committing fraud to steal a family's land, and I have witnesses to this confrontation, and I have a journalist in Sacramento who has already expressed interest in stories about men who abuse their authority." She kept her eyes on his. "You go back to Boston, Edmund. You have that court order quietly set aside, and I know you can, because I know the kind of favors you trade with judges, and you let me live my life. Or every newspaper between here and the Atlantic seaboard gets the story of Edmund Hartwell, respected Boston businessman who followed his runaway wife 3,000 miles and was turned back at gunpoint by the citizens of a Wyoming ranch. You'd destroy your own reputation too. "I don't have a reputation in Boston anymore," she said quietly. "I have one here, and here it's built on bread and honesty and showing up for people, and you cannot touch it." Edmund Hartwell stood in the lamplight of the Hardin Ranch gate and looked at her and Clara. May watched the moment arrive, the moment she had not entirely believed would come. Even now, when he finally actually saw her. Not Mary Cunningham, not the woman he had spent 3 years reducing to something manageable, but the person who had been underneath that reduction the entire time, waiting with the particular patience of things that cannot be permanently extinguished. He did not like what he saw. She had not expected him to. What she had not expected was the thing that came after the dislike, a flicker of something she could only call recognition. The acknowledgement that he was looking at someone he could no longer reach. He put the court order back in his coat. He remounted his horse without a word. At the gate he stopped and looked back once. "You were never what I needed you to be," he said. "No," Clara May said. "I was always what I actually was. You just didn't want that." He rode into the dark and did not look back again. For a long moment, no one spoke. The night settled around them, the ordinary sounds of it: wind in the grass, a horse shifting weight, the distant call of something in the hills. Clara May stood at the gate and felt the adrenaline leave her body all at once, like a tide going out, leaving behind it a bone-deep exhaustion, and something else, something clean and permanent underneath the exhaustion, like ground that has been cleared after a long occupation. Hank's hand found the small of her back. Not demanding anything. Just there. She leaned into it for a moment, just a moment before she straightened. "We should sleep," she said. "Yeah," he said. Neither of them moved immediately. Boyd, with the particular gift of a man who understood the shape of a private moment, had already found somewhere else to be. "He's not going to let it go cleanly," Hank said. "Men like that." "No," she agreed. "But he's going to have to choose between letting it go and making it a public story. And public stories cost him more than I do." She looked at the gate where Edmund had disappeared. "He'll choose himself. He always does." And Weston. Same calculation. Same answer. She turned toward the house. "We have the photographs. We have the testimony. Boyd's cousin wrote down every word tonight. Even with a judge in his pocket, Weston can't make that disappear without making himself the story. And men who operate the way he operates rely on staying out of the story." Inside the kitchen was exactly as she had left it. The starter on the counter, patient and living. The cooling racks with tomorrow's orders. The good, honest smell of a kitchen that was used every single day by someone who cared about the outcome. Lily was asleep upstairs. Mrs. Hargrove was in the sitting room chair, her head drooping over her knitting, and she startled awake when they came in and looked at them with the alert, assessing gaze of a woman who had been listening for trouble and was now determining whether what had returned was the right kind of people. "All right?" she asked. "All right," Clara May said. Mrs. Hargrove nodded, once gathered her knitting, and let herself out with the efficiency of a woman who understood that some situations called for presence and some called for departure. Clara May climbed the stairs quietly, pushed open Lily's door. The girl was deeply asleep, one hand tucked under her cheek, her dark hair spread across the pillow, her face entirely unguarded in the way children's faces go when they feel genuinely safe. Clara May stood in the doorway and looked at her for a long moment, and felt something settle in her chest that had been restless since the moment she had stepped off the stagecoach in Hardin Creek and heard the laughter from the boardwalk. This was what she had come 3,000 miles for, even though she hadn't known it. This specific child, in this specific doorway, in this specific life, that no one had planned and everyone had built together out of necessity and stubbornness, and somewhere along the way, love. She went to bed. She slept. In the morning, Weston's letter arrived before breakfast. His lawyer delivered it, a thin man with the apologetic manner of someone whose job required him to carry other people's retreats. The letter was brief. After reviewing all relevant documentation, the bank had determined the 1882 loan to be fully discharged. The matter was closed. Harlan Weston wished the Dyer family continued success in their operations. Boyd read it aloud at the kitchen table, while Clara May made eggs and Lily sat on her stool pretending to help with the bread, and actually mostly eating bits of raw dough when she thought no one was looking. "We won," Boyd said, setting the letter down. "We survived," Clara May said. "That's different." "Is it?" She thought about it. Looked at Lily, who had flour on her nose and was watching the conversation with those serious, brilliant eyes. Looked at Hank, who was reading the letter again, with the expression of a man who had expected to lose something and is still processing the fact that he didn't. Looked at Boyd, grinning over his coffee cup, irrepressible, as he always was, the constant that held the whole arrangement together. "No," she said finally. "Maybe it's not." The bread business kept growing. The Sacramento food critic, true to his word, published a piece that was picked up by 2 other papers, and orders arrived from businesses Clara May had never heard of, from towns she had never been to. She hired 2 women from the valley, Nora Beggs, whose husband had left her with 4 children and a broken fence, and Ruth Ann Pike, who had been cooking for a mining camp for 3 years and was so tired of beans she had started having dreams about them. They were good workers and better company, and the kitchen, which had once been the territory of Clara May's solitude, became something louder and warmer and more alive. Lily appointed herself quality control, which meant she tasted everything and delivered her verdicts with a seriousness that made Nora laugh every single time. "Too much salt," Lily announced one afternoon, handing back a piece of Ruth Ann's rye. Ruth Ann tasted it. "She's right," she said, sounding genuinely impressed. "How does she know that?" "I taught her," Clara May said simply. Hank had the conversation he had promised himself he would have on a Thursday evening in late October, when the days had gone short and cold, and the kitchen smelled like cinnamon and the last of the season's apples. He came in from the fields at dusk, washed up at the pump, and found Clara May alone for once, Lily at Mrs. Hargrove's for a sewing lesson, and Boyd and the hands still out with the cattle. He sat down at the table. She poured coffee and sat across from him. They looked at each other for a moment. "I have something to ask you," he said. "I know." "You don't know what I'm going to say." "Hank." She held his gaze. "I know." He was quiet for a moment, then something moved through his face. Not the grief for once, not the careful hardness he had built around himself over 2 years of loss, but something underneath all of that. Something that had been there the whole time, and had simply needed the weight above it to shift. He looked at her, the way he had looked at that land grant the night they found it, like something he had given up expecting to find. "Marry me," he said. "Not because Lily needs a mother, though she does, and not because the ranch runs better with you in it, though it does. Because you are the most stubborn, capable, honest, infuriating, magnificent person I have ever known. And somewhere in the last 4 months, I stopped being able to imagine this place without you in it." He reached across the table and took her hand, calloused and steady. "And I'm done being a man who waits until he's certain before he says the real thing. So this is the real thing." Clara May looked at his hand over hers. So different from the last hand that had held her wrists, this one open, patient asking rather than taking. She thought about the stagecoach, about the laughter from the boardwalk, about the wrecked kitchen and the wildflower on the counter, and Lily's voice saying thank you to the empty morning air. About Edmund riding back into the dark. About the starter that had survived everything and was still right now doing its patient work on the counter behind her. "Yes," she said. He smiled. It was a slow smile, the kind that had clearly needed time to remember how to be itself, and it changed his entire face. "Yes to all of it," he said. "Yes to all of it." They were married on a Saturday in November in the yard of Hardin Ranch, with half the valley present and the other half represented by their pies and their bread and the enormous pot of beans that Boyd's mother had driven 40 miles to contribute. Lily wore a dress Mrs. Hargrove had sewn from blue wool and carried a bunch of dried wildflowers she had gathered herself, the same kind she had been leaving beside the starter jar since September. And when the preacher asked if anyone present had reason to object, she looked around at the assembled crowd with an expression that dared them. No one objected. Clara May wore her good dress and no veil because she was done covering things. She stood in the November air, large and solid and entirely herself, and made her promises in a clear voice that carried all the way to the back of the crowd. And she felt for the first time in her life that she was standing exactly where she was supposed to be. The bread business continued to grow through that winter and into the spring beyond it. Nora and Ruth Ann brought in their sisters, and the Hardin Ranch kitchen became something that required a second building stone, this time solid and permanent, built to last by men who were paid fairly and worked hard because the woman who commissioned it treated them like their labor had dignity. Weston left the valley that spring. Rumor came back that he was facing questions in 2 other territories about similar arrangements, similar forged documents, similar families who had found the courage to speak when someone showed them the door. Clara May did not feel satisfaction about this exactly. She felt something more complicated. The recognition that justice, when it finally arrived, rarely looked like what you had imagined and was better for that. Edmund. She did not hear from again. She did not expect to. She had been right about his calculation himself, always above everything else, and she had made herself too costly a story for a man whose entire life depended on controlling narratives. She thought sometimes of the woman he had remarried, reportedly quickly, reportedly young, and she sent a small private prayer in that direction and let it go. On the first anniversary of her arrival in Hardin Creek, Clara May woke before 4, as she always did, went to the kitchen, as she always did, and found Lily already there, sitting at the counter, with the starter jar in front of her. "I was feeding it," Lily said, not defensive, just informational. "I measured the way you taught me. 1 part starter, 1 part flour, 1 part water. I checked the temperature first." Clara May looked at the jar, at the girl, at the kitchen that had been a catastrophe and was now the center of something she still didn't entirely have words for: a business, a family, a life rebuilt from the absolute beginning. "You did it right," she said. Lily looked at the bubbling jar with the solemn satisfaction of a job done correctly. "It's 100 years old," she said. "More probably. And it's still alive." "Still alive!" Clara May agreed. She began the fire in the stove. Outside, the first pale edge of dawn was finding its way up over the eastern hills. Hank would be up in an hour. Boyd would come in from the bunkhouse. Nora and Ruth Ann would arrive at 7 for the day's production. The bread would need to rise and then be shaped and then baked, the same as every morning, the same reliable sequence of patient work that turned simple things into something nourishing. "Mama," Lily said. She said it the way she said most things now, with the quiet confidence of a girl who has found her voice and intends to keep it. "I'm glad you came here." Clara May set her hands on the counter and looked at this child, this whole complicated, brilliant child who had come back from silence to fill a kitchen with her opinions and her laughter and her serious, world-weighing gaze. "Me too, sweetheart," she said. "Me too." She had arrived at Hardin Creek carrying nothing but a battered trunk, a wooden box, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had survived too much to disappear quietly. She had been laughed at on the boardwalk and doubted in the office and threatened by men who believed that power and money were the same thing as winning. She had been afraid most days of something. She had done the work anyway. She had stayed when leaving would have been easier. She had built something out of flour and water and time, and the refusal, absolute and final, to let anyone, any man, any town, any version of her past convince her that she was worth less than the full, solid, unapologetic space she occupied in the world. And the world grudgingly, and then wholeheartedly, had agreed. Clara May Sutton Dyer lit the stove, fed the starter that had crossed a continent alive, and began the bread that would feed her family and her neighbors, and everyone who came to her table hungry. And she did it the way she did everything now, with both hands, her whole self taking up every inch of the life she had earned.